We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will.
All right, let's pause now and make a couple of quick observations. The second part of our story is really going to introduce the smell. Now, there's really kind of two observations here in regards to this smell. The first is just literally that the house begins to emanate a stench that everyone's kind of like, we got to confront her about this. Notice the judge, he's like, I am not going to tell a woman to her face that she smells. And so by night they go and spread lime around and try and cover the smell. Secondly, we find out that there's another kind of smell. Notice on page 821 that we're told in the first full paragraph, the Gersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. The speaker of our story, notice in 2 paragraphs down, the day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, as is our custom. So the speaker of this text is looking at Emily and the Grierson family and saying they held their nose a little too high. It's kind of the opposite of the house that smells. It's that these people think the rest of the town smells and everybody else. So you've got this interesting kind of dialectic at play here in the second part. Of course, we are continuing with our story, and one of the obvious questions is, what is the smell, right, that emanates out of the house? Of course, the smell of a decaying house, the smell of a decaying family comes to mind immediately. By the way, on page 820, just for a pause here, you have inserted there on page 820 some information. Let's take a look at it. The American Experience, 2 influential writers. William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway were probably the 2 most influential American writers of the 20th century, even though they were near opposites. Although Faulkner longed for adventure as a young man, he settled in a tiny corner of rural Mississippi. His prose was dense and complex and featured long, ornate sentences. Hemingway, on the other hand, lived a life of epic adventure, traveling the world, hunting big game. His prose, precise and unadorned, introduced a new way of writing to American literature. Both men won the Nobel Prize, Faulkner in 1950, Hemingway in 1954. And though they shared a grudging respect, they also waged a famous war of words. Hemingway said that Faulkner, quote, wrote like an old grandmother, end quote. And Faulkner replied that Hemingway was, quote, afraid to use a word of more than 5 letters, end quote. Now, of course, you can see already in Rose for Emily that you have long sentences that are quite different from our study earlier of Hemingway's In Another Country. All right, let's turn now to part 3, and we'll continue with our story about Emily.
She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl, with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer, after her father's death, they began the work. The construction company came with niggers and mules and machinery, and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ruddy man, with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the niggers, and the niggers singing in time to the rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon, he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently, we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons, driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first, we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, of course, a Grierson would not think seriously of a Northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige, without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, "Poor Emily, her kinsfolk should come to her." She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, the crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. And as soon as the old people said, "Poor Emily," the whispering began. "Do you suppose it's really so?" they said to one another. "Of course it is. What else could?" This behind their hands, rustling of craned silk and satin behind jalousies closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the matched team passed. Poor Emily. She carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. Like when she bought the rat poison, the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say, "Poor Emily," and while the two female cousins were visiting her. "I want some poison," she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes, in a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets, as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. "I want some poison," she said. "Yes, Miss Emily. What kind? For rats and such? I'd reckon I want the best you have. I don't care what kind." The druggist named several. "They'll kill anything up to an elephant. But what you want is..." "Arsenic," Miss Emily said. "Is that a good one?" "Is arsenic?" "Yes, ma'am. But what you want..." "I want arsenic." The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. "Why, of course," the druggist said, "if that's what you want, but the law requires you to tell what you're going to use it for." Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye, until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. The Negro delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, "For rats."
Let's pause for a moment, make a couple of observations. One of the things, of course, when we read this text now today, right, we have to say out loud that it is unfortunate, of course, that the N word does get used in this story. And I apologize that I didn't kind of give you a heads up in the beginning for this. Faulkner, of course, is playing the game of the Deep South, where this word, of course, is accepted, certainly within the time that Faulkner is writing, as being acceptable designation. Of course, today we see it as something abhorrent, right? But there it is in the story nonetheless. The other thing we need to say about the third act, if you will, the third part of the story, is we have the introduction of the love interest in Baron. And let's talk a little bit about Baron. Of course, we're told on page 822 that he's a northerner and he's a day laborer. So we're in the Deep South after the Civil War. So clearly, they imagine, she can't be attracted to somebody from the north, and yet apparently she is. She's seen in public with him, and he's just a day laborer. He just works. They can't believe that she would step down out of her lofty status to be seen publicly with him. And for a brief period of time, they are together. They begin to say "poor Emily" because they believe that in some way she's probably stepped down from her higher estate. That is to say, the best she could get is this guy, and so she's with him. There's another interpretation of this "poor Emily," which is obviously that she has slept with him without marrying him. And in the Deep South, this is totally against all of the rules. Poor Emily. Finally, we're told, for reasons we're not explained as to why, that Emily goes to the drugstore and wants poison, and she wants the most powerful poison of all, arsenic. Now, she won't say what she's going to use this for, and ultimately she's just given the arsenic. We're now on page 824. All right, let's go to part 4. the story starts to get a little bit interesting, and some have called it almost like a mystery story of a kind. Let's keep reading.
4. So the next day we all said, "She will kill herself." And we said it would be the best thing. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said, "She will marry him." Then we said, "She will persuade him yet," because Homer himself had remarked, he liked men and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later we said, "Poor Emily," behind the jalousies, as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy, Miss Emily with her head high, and Homer Barron with his hat cocked, and a cigar in his teeth, reins and whip in a yellow glove. Then some of the ladies began to say it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. He would never divulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday, they again drove about the streets, and the following day, the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama. So she had bloodkin under her roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first, nothing happened. Then, we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later, we learned that she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, "They are married." We were really glad. We were glad because the 2 female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished some time since, was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming, or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time, it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week they departed, and, as we had expected all along, within 3 days Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. The Negro man went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime, but for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father, which had thwarted her woman's life so many times, had been too virulent and too furious to die. When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years, it grew grayer and grayer until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray, when it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death, at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years, when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms, where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sartorus's contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and in the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted. Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away, and did not send their children to her with boxes of color and tedious brushes and pictures cut from the ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last one, and remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly, we watched the Negro grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December, we sent her a tax notice, which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. Now and then, we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house, like the carven torso of an idol in a niche, looking or not looking at us. We could never tell which. Thus, she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died. Fell ill in the house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering Negro man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information from the Negro. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty, as if from disuse. She died in one of the downstairs rooms, in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow, yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight.
All right, so let's talk about part 4 here really quickly. We have, of course, the continuation of this love romance with Homer Barron, right? The assumption is they're married, then he leaves, then the cousins leave, then Homer Barron comes back, and then nobody sees from him again. And of course, this starts to look like a lot like maybe she's the jilted lover, right? Okay. Meanwhile, she grows old, right? And every once in a while, she's spotted up in a window, right? She dies at 74, we're told. She says, or we're told that the new generation came and they wanted to deliver the mail to her house, but to do that they needed to put up numbers on her door and a mailbox, and she refused to allow it. She's not going to move into the future. And then finally on page 826, she passed, we're told, from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. In other words, it's very difficult to qualify Emily. Is she a sweet old lady? Or is she just kind of like a nut? Or is she kind of really mean and evil? It's hard to say. Finally, she dies. The upstairs of the house has now been closed off for many years, and the only one that is with her is her old servant, who doesn't talk to anybody, right? A complete and total recluse. Now, finally, part 5. What is going on? And let's go ahead and put it in our notes. The title of this story is called A Rose for Emily. Now we're going to have to jot down, why would the title of this story be called that? Let's jump to it. Part 5.
The Negro met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in, with their hushed, sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back, and was not seen again. The 2 female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the 2nd day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre. And the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall, as of the tomb, seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal, upon the valance curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver, silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and tie, as if they had just been removed, which, lifted, left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded. Beneath it, the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him, and upon the pillow beside him, lay that even coating of the patient and abiding dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron-gray hair.
Now, the end of this story has always been much debated. What exactly is going on here? Let's go ahead and work through it really quickly, part 5. Of course, first we should point out that Emily will die at the conclusion of part 4, and now in part 5 we're kind of told about what happens after she dies. At her funeral, we're told that any number